There is a castle in the Scottish Highlands so remote that the nearest town is a 40-minute drive through empty moorland. Its granite walls have stood since 1856. Kings and queens have walked its hallways. The world looks at Balmoral and sees royalty, tradition, and quiet elegance. But the women who cleaned its floors, polished its silver, and kept its fires burning saw something completely different. They saw a world hidden behind locked doors and lifelong silence agreements. And one by one, they made the same decision. They packed their bags and left. Not because the work was too hard. Not because of the remote location. The real reason these maids walked away from one of the most famous castles on Earth is something that will stay with you long after this video ends. To understand why so many women eventually walked out, you first need to understand what they were walking into. When a new maid arrived at Balmoral for the first time, the sheer scale of the place was overwhelming. The estate covered over 53,000 acres. There were more than 150 buildings scattered across the grounds. Inside the main castle alone, there were 167 rooms. And every single inch of it had to be maintained to a standard that had not changed in over a century. From day one, the expectations were not explained gently. They were handed down like commands from another era entirely. New arrivals were not given a warm welcome or proper tour. They were handed a uniform, pointed toward a staircase, and expected to figure out the rest through observation and silence. Some women later said the hardest part of the first week was not the workload. It was the loneliness of not being allowed to ask questions. The daily schedule started before most people had even opened their eyes. By 6 in the morning, the youngest maids were already in the oldest kitchen, bent over long wooden tables, polishing more than 200 pieces of silver by hand. Not with modern cleaning products or electric tools. By hand, with soft cloths and careful pressure, making sure every surface caught the light just right. Breakfast had to be served by 8. Then came the long walk through cold stone corridors carrying heavy tea kettles, moving quietly enough not to disturb the royal dogs sleeping nearby. By midday, they were back in the kitchen peeling 18 kilos of potatoes. By 4 in the afternoon, they had changed into fresh uniforms and were preparing for tea service. And when that was done, they were on their knees cleaning the mud from hunting boots left outside the royal quarters. Most nights, they finally reached their attic bedroom somewhere around 9:45. That was a 15-hour day. And there was no overtime. The old staff manual had a line that said, simply, "Loyalty is its own reward." One former maid said it felt like giving your life to a shadow. And no one ever said thank you. But the hours alone were not what broke people. It was the rules. Balmoral operated under a code of conduct that felt less like a modern workplace and more like something out of a Victorian novel. One rule in particular left new maids completely stunned when they first encountered it. If a member of the royal family left a room and a maid entered even moments later, she was still required to curtsy to the empty space. It was meant to honor the spirit of the royal who had just been present. During one evening in 1987, staff counted 61 of these curtsies in a single night. By the end of it, some maids had bruised their knees so badly that bandages were quietly handed out alongside their serving trays. One woman described it as curtsying to ghosts. It was not a rule designed to make them feel respected. It was a rule that made perfectly clear how little their dignity mattered when weighed against tradition. And because no one in authority ever questioned it, younger maids assumed it was simply how the world worked inside these walls. They learned to lower themselves without flinching. They learned to treat their own pain as something unremarkable. Speaking was another minefield. Maids were not permitted to speak unless directly spoken to by a royal. If a maid accidentally overheard a private conversation, she was expected to give no sign that she had registered a single word. In July 1986, a young maid was dusting a hallway when she heard Prince Charles whispering to Diana nearby. Another servant immediately hissed at her to act deaf. The next morning, she received a written warning. The rule was absolute. Register what a royal says, even accidentally, and you risked losing your end-of-season bonus. Do it twice, and you were dismissed. Over time, staff developed their own silent language. Hand signals passed between them during breakfast service. The hallways of Balmoral, according to those who worked there, were not quiet out of reverence. They were quiet out of fear. Everyone was watching. Every silence was survival. Then came the issue that ate away at people the slowest, but hit the hardest. The pay. In 1983, the lowest-level housemaid at Balmoral earned around $18,000 a year before tax. That was barely $4,000 more than the average British worker, despite the fact that she was working 60 hours a week and living on the estate full-time. It took 3 full years to be promoted to first housemaid, and that promotion raised wages to just $21,500. Meanwhile, male gamekeepers on the same estate were earning around $26,000. Women doing longer hours in more physically demanding conditions were being paid considerably less. Many left after only 1 year. A royal historian later described the atmosphere it created as a quiet tension that was never spoken but always felt, like standing in the cold wearing silk gloves. What made that tension particularly difficult to carry was that the women knew, on some level, that speaking about it was not really an option. Every new worker since the 1980s had been required to sign secrecy agreements that extended for the rest of their lives. Breaking them could mean being sued for 6-figure amounts. So they kept their frustrations in the same place they kept everything else at Balmoral, behind a polished surface and a lowered gaze. And the cold was not just a metaphor. Until 1994, maids at Balmoral slept in attic rooms that dropped to 4 degrees Celsius at night. Hot water ran for exactly 30 minutes each morning. Heaters were not allowed because management said they posed a fire risk. Back in January 1983, a young maid named Fiona shared a 12-square-meter room with 2 other women. The windows were single-pane glass, thin enough that their breath frosted the walls as they slept. In 1987, staff were promised warmer sleeping quarters by 1990. That promise was never kept. By the end of that decade, more than a third of the maids had quit. Reports from a 1998 university research project described rain leaking through broken slate roofs, women waking at 6 in the morning wearing damp uniforms that gave them chilblains. 2 maids caught pneumonia and were then fired for missing work because of it. It was not until 1992 that electric heaters were finally installed, and only after a formal government warning forced the issue. Vacuum cleaners were banned entirely. Queen Elizabeth disliked the sound of them. So every morning, 2 maids would lower themselves to their knees and push small horsehair brushes across the carpets by hand. Cleaning just one hallway took 4 to 5 minutes. The dust accumulated so heavily that they had to rinse their aprons twice a day. In 1990, the head housekeeper calculated that the ban added 9 full hours of labor to each daily shift. The pay did not change to reflect that. Staff reported that their wrists hurt so badly from the repetitive motion that they struggled to hold cutlery during meals. The castle gleamed on the outside, but behind every perfect rug, something quieter was spreading. What made it harder to accept was that the people setting these rules were not unaware of the strain. Supervisors saw the swollen wrists. They watched women rinse their aprons in cold water before lunch and return to the same floors without a word of acknowledgement. The system was not broken by accident. It was maintained deliberately, because changing it would have meant admitting it had been wrong all along. There was also a social structure inside the castle that most outsiders never knew existed. Not all staff were treated equally even among themselves. The kind of invitation a worker received to the annual Gillies Ball told them exactly where they stood. Gold edge cards went to those closest to the family. Plain white cards went to everyone else. At midnight, when the royals quietly left the room, every staff member present bowed in silence regardless of how tired their feet were or how early their shift began the next morning. It was a reminder, dressed up as a celebration, that the hierarchy never really rested. Even during the one night a year when a dishwasher might dance with a prince, the rules found a way to reassert themselves before anyone went to bed. Several maids who attended the ball in their early years described it as a strange and bittersweet experience. The music was real. The dancing was real. But the moment the clock struck midnight and the royals disappeared through a side door, the spell broke completely. The next morning it was back to horsehair brushes and cold corridors, as if the evening had never happened at all. There were also moments that revealed a more human side of royal life, and those moments made the contrast even harder to sit with. During a formal dinner in August 1987, a guest accidentally drank from the finger bowl, mistaking rose-scented water for soup. It could have been a humiliating moment for the man. Instead, the Queen quietly picked up her own finger bowl and sipped from it. One by one, every royal at the table followed. Staff counted 17 empty bowls at the end of that dinner. It was a small act, but the maids who witnessed it never forgot it. A family that would rather drink perfume than let a stranger feel embarrassed. And yet those same maids went home that night to frozen attic rooms and wrists that ached from scrubbing floors that no machine was allowed to touch. What finally began cracking the surface was the internet. In 2024, maids started posting online about what was really happening inside those granite walls. One woman described being required to clean 12 royal suites before lunchtime, each containing antique glass chandeliers and historic mirrors that had to be completely spotless. If Camilla's room was not finished within 55 minutes, the maid lost her lunch break. They were being paid £10.90 an hour for this. Many compared notes and realized they could walk into a standard hotel job nearby and earn more while working fewer hours under far better conditions. So that is exactly what they did. The moment that brought everything to a boil happened in June 2023. A young maid known only as Heather Glenn went onto an online forum and shared screenshots from her conversation with management. Her mother was going into surgery. She had requested emergency leave. She had only used 2 of her 10 available leave days that year. Her request was denied. She was told she had to stay and starch Princess Kate's linens. She quit that day. The post spread rapidly. Over 11,000 people commented. 2 weeks later, a new job listing quietly appeared on an employment website. It was for a room attendant at Balmoral, offering £10.50 an hour and listing the position as urgently needed. The palace described it as a coincidence. Insiders said 5 more maids handed in their notice within days of that listing going public. The response from management only deepened the wound. Temporary workers were brought in from Aberdeen and paid £19 an hour. Nearly double what the loyal long-term staff had been receiving. The message it sent to those who had stayed was not lost on anyone. Word spread fast among the remaining staff. When the people brought in to replace you are immediately offered twice your wage, it stops feeling like an oversight. It starts feeling like a statement. Several women who had given 3 or 4 years of loyal service handed in their notices that same week. They did not leave angry. They left quietly. The same way they had always been required to live inside those walls. By August 2025, the breaking point arrived completely in the open. On the morning of August 4th, the massive iron gates of Balmoral were locked shut. The official explanation was an incoming storm, with winds reaching 90 miles per hour. But almost 2/3 of the room attendants had already walked out the previous night. They said they would not sleep on floors any longer, not in staff quarters where the roofs were deteriorating above their heads. Thousands of tourists arrived and were turned away. It was the first time Balmoral had closed its doors to the public in that manner since the foot-and-mouth crisis of 2001. 2 housekeepers remained inside. Rain began pushing through the old windows by midday. The image of that locked gate, posted online within hours, became a symbol that carried more weight than any formal statement the palace could have released. It told the story in a single frame. The castle was still standing. But the people who made it function had finally walked away. A leaked payroll file from late 2024 had already shown the world the numbers in plain form. A senior royal aide earned $146,000. A maid earned $19,500 and had to share a room. The pay gap was more than 7 times. That same year, the sovereign grant, the public money allocated to the royal family, had risen to $85.9 million, up 41% over 10 years. Maid wages had gone up 6% over the same period. Experts calculated that raising wages to a fair level across the estate would cost an additional $187,000 per year. That figure was less than what the estate had spent resurfacing its private helicopter pad. When that comparison spread across social media, the reaction was swift and overwhelming. People who had never given a second thought to who cleaned royal bedrooms were suddenly paying very close attention. The women who left Balmoral were not making a dramatic statement. They were making a practical one. They had spent years curtsying to empty rooms, whispering in cold hallways, sleeping in freezing attics, and scrubbing floors on their knees for wages that barely covered a modest life in rural Scotland. They had signed papers promising lifelong silence. They had been told that loyalty was its own reward. And eventually, quietly, they decided it was not. The real reason these maids left Balmoral Castle is not one single thing. It is the slow accumulation of being treated as invisible by the very place that needed the most. The castle still stands. The granite still sparkles in the Scottish hills. But the women who kept it that way are gone. And the walls, for once, cannot pretend otherwise. If you are still watching, you already know you love stories like this one. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss what we uncover next.